All right, so how's it going today?
I'm fine.
Good, good.
Good.
All right, cool. So, um, now, question: everyone here already knows how to play the G chord, the C chord, and the D chord already? Those three. Did we do all those? Yeah. All right. So, what we're going to do, we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to do those chords, but we're going to add some chords to them. All right. This is going to be, I think this is going to be pretty cool. What we're going to do. All right, because we're gonna change the chords a little bit, and we're gonna be able to use those. So now we can get the chords to sound a little bit different. So we're gonna start with the D chord. So who here does not remember how to play D?
I need a refresher on the chords.
Okay, no problem. So we'll do that real quick, okay? All right, so all right, so remember this line is our top string. That's our E string right there, okay? So that's the top string up here. This line is the next string. That's our A string right there. This line, that's our D string. That's the very next string. This line is the next string. That's our G. This line is the next string, B. And this line is the last string on the bottom. That's our E string. Okay, pretty simple. Now this line going across on top here, that is the nut. That's this thing that's holding the strings together. Okay, right there. Okay, so now this first line here, okay, that's our first fret. So anything that's written above this line is going to be in the first fret. This is our second fret. So anything written in between these two lines, that's going to be our second fret. This one is our third fret. And this last one, that's going to be the fourth fret. So anything above that line is going to be the fourth fret. Okay, now bear with me for a second here because I'm not the greatest artist in the world, but I'm going to draw a hand. Let's see how I do this time. Big fat fingers, okay. At least they're right size this time. Okay, so our pointer finger is number 1. Our middle finger is number 2. Our ring finger is 3. And 4 is our pinky. Okay, so when we're playing a D, let's say we take the number 1. We're going to write the number 1 here. So number 1, that just means that our first finger, our index finger, is going to go on the G string. And let me just write the names down here, the strings, so that that way if you forget them, you have this to remember them by. D, G, D, and then I like to write a little e so we know we're dealing with the little string. Okay, so that finger goes there. So that finger is going to go on the G string on the second fret. And our middle finger is also going to be on the second fret, but on the bottom string. Okay. And then our ring finger is going to go on the string in between them, but on the third fret. Okay, so that's what we're holding. Now the other strings are going to do something different. So this 0 that I put up here means we're going to hit that string, but we're not pushing it down. So we're just going to play it open. That's what we call that. When we play a string and not push it down, it's called open. And the X here means don't play those strings. So the top 2 strings we're not going to play. All right, and this is called the D major chord. Okay, that's the name of this chord. D major. And when we say major, it just means it sounds happy. It's not, it does sound happy. When you play that, make sure you only play those bottom 4 strings, right? It does sound happy. You know, like the word actually can mean a lot more than that, but just to keep it simple, major just means that it's going to have a happy or a positive sound to it. All right, so that's our D major chord. Okay. So now I'll get rid of this hand. All right, and what we're going to do now is, all right, so now here is our next chord. This one is going to be our C major. Okay. So our C major on the top string, we're still not playing here. Okay. But we're going to put our ring finger on the A string on the 3rd fret. Then our middle finger is going to go on the 2nd fret of the D string. The next string is open, so we don't have to worry about putting anything there. The next string, we're going to put our pointer finger on the 1st fret. And then the last string is open again. So now we have these 2 chords. We have D and C. And from just by trying to do each one, it looks like they have nothing in common with each other except the name major, right, in the name. But if we look closely, all right, look at this. This is kind of funny, right? So I'm going to circle this part here and this part here. If you notice, it's the same fingers on the same frets, 1 string away from each other on both. They're not on the same string, but the shape is the same. Right? Like that ring finger is 1 string above and 1 fret up from the middle finger. So that we can play these 2 chords and keep that shape. Watch, I'll show you my hands. So watch this. So I have this shape here, the D chord. I play that. Now I'm just going to bring those 2 fingers up here, and I bring this finger down to the 1st fret. So it's actually not as hard as it looks. It's not the easiest thing to do for doing it for the first time, that's for sure. But it makes it a lot easier to know that we don't have to do much change with our hands to go from that chord to that chord. Okay, so by keeping that in mind, that those fingers are doing the same shape from D to C, it makes it a lot easier to switch. Okay, and now the 3rd chord. Okay, and this is going to be our G chord here. Watch. So we're going to go, and if you watch this again, this is really funny. We got, I don't know what happened there. Let's try it again. Okay, our ring finger is going to go on the top string on the 3rd fret. And then our middle finger is going to go on the 2nd fret of the A string. And look, here we're doing it again. The same thing that we just did. It's happening again here with this chord. See that? So all 3 of these chords are actually doing the same shape. Now the next 3 strings is all open. And then the last string, we're going to actually use our pinky for. Okay, and that means that we're going to use our pinky on the 3rd fret. And this one is G major. Okay, so that's our G major chord. So it's funny, all three of these chords have those two fingers doing the same thing, but just on different strings. D, C, G. And if you watch my hands, I'll turn this off for a second. If you watch my hands, notice that these two fingers are not going to change how their shape is for each chord, right? Like, see? So the finger shape actually stays the same with all three chords. So that actually should make it a lot easier to play all three of these chords when you look at it like that. All right, like you're still gonna have to practice them and still work on them to get them down, but seeing that should make it at least a little bit easier, knowing you can just keep those fingers together and just move them up and down the strings, and you'll be right with each chord. Now, these chords, I've talked about this before. I don't know if you have heard this, then you know. If you haven't, then this is new information. But I like these three chords because we can do lots and lots of songs with these. There are so many songs that exist today that use these three chords. All right, but the trick is this. You may go, I like this song, but it doesn't sound like there's three chords. And you could be right. You might be hearing a song that goes like this. Yeah. Well, what was that other chord? Because that one chord sounded weird, didn't it? Right? Who thinks this chord actually sounds kind of strange? But not in a bad way. It just sounds a little different, right? So this is actually still a D chord, and I'm going to draw this with a different color. Okay, so what we're going to do is, even though we are playing a D, we're going to actually switch our fingers around. I'm going to show you a new way to play it. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, instead of our first finger being here, we're going to actually put our, oops, wrong one. We're going to put our middle finger here. So we're going to draw a 2 there. Okay. So let's do that. We're going to go middle finger on the G string now. In fact, I should get it right. Okay. So we got our middle finger there. We have our third finger there. And instead of playing this, we're not going to play that one. We're going to put our first finger here. Okay. So now we have this new type of chord, and we're going to call this chord D7. Okay. And that whenever you see that 7, just know this, that 7 just means we're adding a note to the chord that's not usually found in the normal version of the chord. So that 7 actually is telling you that it's the 7th note that we can use. And that's where we get that sound from, because it's a different note added to the chord. Right? So we have our D7, and we could play like, and then go to G. And see, it's actually fit pretty well, right? So what people like to do with these chords that have that 7 in them, we call them 7th chords, because they have the number 7. And the 7th chord is used to make something feel like it has to go somewhere. So that D7, we're going to use it to make the song that we're doing feel like we have to get back to G. okay, by doing that. And see, once we get to G, it feels like we fixed it, right? Like whatever that was, like, you know, like who's ever gone on a roller coaster and after a while is like, this has to end. I'm done with this. Anyone ever feel that way? Right? Like some roller coasters are just fun the whole time, and some they're fun for like a minute, and then after a while you're like, oh no, I can't take it anymore. That's kind of like how this chord is, right? But not like a roller coaster, but you know, you feel it and it feels like it's got to give up. And once we get to that G chord, it's like, oh, all that tension, whatever that was, that feeling that we have in here, it's going to go away. Right? And now, who felt that? Who felt like, oh, as soon as we switched to G, it fixed it? So I want you to do that on your guitar. I want you to play that D7, play it for a little bit, and then switch to G. I want you to feel that for yourself. How that switch from that 7 to the G feels for you. Okay? So go ahead and do that. All right, did everyone get to do that? Spend a minute just going from that D7 back to that G chord, and just to hear it for yourself. Now, if your guitar is not in tune, all right, you're probably not going to experience that sound, right? Because if your guitar is out of tune, well, the chord's not going to sound correct. So I do have a solution if anyone does need it. All right, I do have on my website a guitar tuner. Okay. And also, I do have these clip-on tuners. So if anyone wants to get one of these, which are really cool, they just clip on and tells you, just let me know and we can get you one, okay? So we've gone over this D7 to G chord. Everyone can feel that, right? Everyone felt that with their own guitar, right? How that,
Yes.
when you went from that D7 to that G, well, that's called, in music, we say it resolved, right? Like it felt like we went home. Like G is our home. So every chord that we play that's not G, right? And that's only for these sets of chords. Like when it comes down to other chords, maybe A is home, maybe E is home. So it depends on what chords, the group of chords that we're using. But for these three, G is home. Okay, so when we get back to G, we say it was resolved, right? That's the word that we use. We say we've gone home. We went back to our home chord, G. So D builds up tension, and now we resolved it with the G major, right? We've gone home. Okay, so now that was cool, right? That worked out pretty well. But now we still have two other chords, and we got to do something with these chords. Something interesting. So let's go to our C major. All right, so I did something with that C major in there, right? And all I did was I just added, my pinky here. I'm going to draw it in red. So every time I draw it in a different color, that just means I'm changing the type of chord we're doing. So I'm just adding my pinky there. And that gives us a C7. Okay, so now we have a D7 and we have a C7. Okay. So all the other notes are the same. We just added that pinky in. And it doesn't give us that same feeling from the D7 to the G, but it does give us something. Right? So we can use that C7 chord now in whatever we're playing, or we can use C7, D7, back to G. Or we could do a regular D. And of course, as always, once we get back to G, it feels like we've kind of come to the end or the conclusion, right? The resolve. That's what that's called. I'm going to keep repeating that because resolve is it's a big word that I think a lot of musicians really need to know. So that's the word I'm going to be using a lot today. All right. So it's always going to resolve on G, but now we have that C7, and it works pretty cool with the regular D major chord, right? So we can go C7, D. See? And then once we get to G, you can really feel that now, right? Once we're using that C7 to D, and then back to G, you can really feel that we've gone home now, right? Once we get back to that G, watch, I'll do it again. So we got C7 to D major, C7 to G. All right, so I want you to try that on your own. Don't worry about doing the strumming or switching as fast as I'm doing it. Just play it. C7 to D major, or you can try it with D7. Back to C, and then to G there. And see how that feels for you, okay? And once we get to that G, you're like, oh yeah, that's it. That's home. So I want to make sure everyone can hear that when you're playing, because if you can hear it and you notice it and you feel that G as like, oh yeah, that's the end of the song right there, then that means two things. One, you have a very good ear. So you're going to be a great musician. And the second thing is that you need to be able to recognize where home is. And if you're learning a new song, so if we're doing a song like that and you're like looking at the chords, you don't know which one is the home chord until you hear it. But once you hear it, you go, oh, that's it. That's the home chord. Maybe it's C, maybe it's G. But once you can find that chord that brings you home, it makes it very easy for you to figure out all the other chords that go with it. Because let's say you find out that the song, actually the home chord is G. You go, oh, it's G. So I know there's probably a C in there, and there's probably also a D. And now that you know these two new versions of D and C, you might be able to use those in that song as well. All right, so now we're going to go on to the next one. So our G chord. All right, we got a fancy version here. So first thing is we're going to get rid of the pinky here. Okay, that's the first thing for this one. And we're going to use our pointer finger on the first fret there. Okay, and this chord is called G7. So now we have 7 chords for each chord that we know now. So we have regular D, D7. We have C major, C7. Then we have G major, now G7. And now notice the only one we really have to do any kind of real change here on is that D major, right? That's the only one. The other ones is just one finger difference. I'm going to redraw the numbers here for everyone, okay? All right, so we should have both of them. Okay. So now we have that G7. So now, if you notice what I did there was I played a G7 in the beginning. And by doing that, it gave us this feeling like we're kind of home, but we can go somewhere with this. So we play this G7, and even though it is home, it doesn't quite feel like we've come to the end, right? So that G7, even though it's a G chord, it doesn't sound like we can really stop the song there, right? So we know G7 works, but it's not our home. It has to be the G major chord to be home. Anything else is just going to be, so any change to the G major chord kind of takes away from it feeling like we've come to the end of it, right? All right, so now let's go back to our regular D major chord here. I will get rid of this X. Now, with our regular D major, we can play that C7 and G7. In fact, let us do this first. Before we go to the next thing, let's actually practice going from D7 to C7 to G7. And don't think that this is going to be too hard, because even though the C7 is kind of a tough chord, the G7 is almost like C major. Like this just moves over one, it moves over to here, and then these two move up one string. That's it. So it's actually going from C to G. It's actually not that hard at all. It's pretty simple. You're just moving your fingers up or down a string. Other than that, you're almost holding the same chord. So let's try that again. Let's go from D7 to C7 to G7. And don't worry about doing it fast. Just get used to the switch from D7, G7, G7. Sorry, C7, G7. Okay. So now we're going to move on to a new set of these chords, okay? So we have regular D major now. So let's go back to our regular D. Remember, it's in black, okay? So if you forgot, look at the black, look at the black numbers, and that's our D major again. Okay? And now all we're gonna do, we're gonna change this up just a little bit. We're just gonna put our pinky right there on the 3rd fret. And now that D, it doesn't sound bad either. It doesn't have that funky sound that the D7 has. But it is doing something to the sound, right? So what this is called is a suspended chord, okay? And let me actually do that in the right color this time. So we're gonna call it D sus, and that's short for D suspended. And suspended just means like it's kind of stuck, like it can't continue on, right? And that's really what suspended means. Like when something is suspended, that means it's been stopped, and stopped before it's finished. So if we play that D sus, that's what we call it for short, D suspended. And we go right back to D major by lifting up our pinky. See, that sounds like home right there now, doesn't it? D sus, D major. So that's another cool little trick that we can use to do this. All right, and now, so now we're switching between D suspended and D major. And all it is just that pinky going down on the string, coming up off the string. Down on the string, up off the string. And it would be a good thing to actually practice switching back and forth between the D suspended and the D major. It's a really good pinky exercise. Okay. Any questions about that so far? No? All right, cool. So now we can actually use the D suspended with the D major into our other chords. So let's say we go D major, D suspended, C major, and I went to G7 that time, just to get a little fancy. So now we're kind of, because of that G7, it doesn't feel like we've gone home yet, right? So we can try the same thing with the regular G and see what happens. D major to D suspended, C, G. Right? Now we've gone all the way through. The D suspended, and we could do that C7 as well. It doesn't actually matter. So we can, that's the cool thing about this, is that we can take basically any note or any one of these chords and combine them with any one of the other chords. Okay, so we have D major or D suspended or D7, and we can play C major or C7 or G major or G7. So all these chords, all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all 7 of these chords that we have so far all work with each other. So now we got a lot of stuff we can do. So D major, D suspended, C7, G major. That's pretty cool. And I think that sounds really good. Right? I think, especially when I put that C7, I thought that sounded really nice with that. So now, what we can do with just the D suspended and the D major is we can actually come up with our own see, just by switching those, the D suspended and D major, we can actually play around with this chord now. And we come up with stuff, we can pick the different notes out. See? And that's just the D major and D suspended. So it's really cool. I want everyone to do that for a minute. I just want you to just pluck the different notes in the D major chord and switch to the D suspended chord while you're plucking those notes. All right, so everyone took a minute to do that. Should come up with at least something that sounded all right. So remember, when you're switching that chord, make sure when you're playing that note, that's when you're switching back and forth. Now, like, you don't want to do, because it just would sound the same the whole time. So just make sure that you are playing the different notes, those 2 different notes that you're doing when you're switching those chords. Okay, now the cool thing about this suspended chord is the D suspended is not alone, okay? The C chord also has a suspended chord, okay? And we're gonna do the same thing, but we're gonna put that pinky on that string instead. So now when we play the C major, we can put our pinky on the D string. But make sure that when you play it, you want people to be able to really hear that suspended sound. So you're gonna have to make sure you hit that string a little bit harder and make it more clear, because those higher notes are really gonna try to fight for that sound. But you can hear it there. So that's our C suspended. Now there is another way to do it, but I'm not going to recommend doing it that way right now, because it is a little tough, and it might be a little bit too hard to do at the moment. Okay, but you could. I will show it to you. Oops, wrong one. And it would just be to use this first finger on the first fret there. And that would be another way you can do that C suspended. But that means you can't let go of this note here, the other one. So you have to push down both strings with that one finger at the same time. And that is why I recommend not doing it that way for now, because it might be a little too hard for some people to do. Push down both those strings with one finger. All right, so now we have our C. Suspended, back to C. And as you can see, as you can hear, like when you were playing it, it's a little bit more hidden than the D suspended, right? That D suspended is very obvious. But that C major to C suspended, it's a little more hidden because of how low the note is that we're changing. All right, so we can actually go D major, D suspended, to C major, C suspended. So D major, D suspended, C suspended, to C major. All right, I accidentally did that C7, so don't do what I did. But let's do that again. D major, D suspended, C suspended, the C major. Or you can do them any which way you want. So now we have 8 different chords we can play with just these 3 chords. That's crazy. That's 8 chords we have now, just from 3 chords. I think that's pretty awesome, because now we have all these different sounds we can do with just these 3 chords. Imagine if we play the C major, C suspended, and the C7, and just doing C. We can do a lot of stuff with that. I think that's pretty awesome. All right, C major, C suspended, C major, C7, C major, C suspended, to C major. So it's pretty cool. We mess around with that. Plus, this is a really, really good exercise for your pinky to practice switching from C major to C suspended to C7. Switching between those 3 Cs is going to really help your pinky get stronger. And you really want a strong pinky, okay, when you're playing guitar. I know some guys, they'll use only 2 fingers or 3 fingers when they're first starting, because they don't like using their pinky. But the pinky is so important to playing guitar. Okay, that it's going to make all the difference. I've seen guys struggle playing things because they're using 3 fingers. And I'm like, well, just use your pinky. And it's so much easier. And some guys just don't like doing that. But their guitar playing does suffer a little bit because of not using the pinky. All right, so now we're going to go to this G chord. So we got D major, D7, and D suspended. We have C major, C7, and C suspended. Well, guess what G has? G also has a suspended chord, and it's here. Okay, so we don't have to worry about the red number because we're not actually going to be pushing it down because it's a regular G. And we're just going to add our pointer finger to the first fret of the B string. And that gives us our G suspended. And this is a great chord because now that suspended chord, because it has that stop sound, like we're stopped but we didn't finish, it's going to really, once we go to that G major afterwards, we're going to really feel like we've gone home now. So let's do that. G suspended to G major. Whew, that's it. Everyone's going to go home now. Well, everyone's home, right? But, you know, imagine if you're playing a show and you do that G suspended to a regular G, everyone's going to get up and leave. They're going to clap. Oh my God, that was amazing. Then they're going to get up and leave. You're like, wait a second. I just started. So now that's pretty cool. And if you look at our G suspended and our G7, you can see that to go from one to the other is not that hard. It's not that tricky. I think the hardest part is probably the pinky. So I think the hardest part of that is taking your pinky and putting it back down. But now we have 9 chords, just from 3 chords. We have 9 chords that we can use, and we can make up all kinds of really amazing stuff with it, right? So let's say we start with D. And we go D major and D suspended. Then we're going to go to C, D, and C suspended. And then we end on G. And you can really feel that ending, right? So we have, this time we'll do D7. Wow, I think that sounded pretty good. Who thought that sounded really good? Yeah, that's not bad. So now you have 3 versions for each chord, D, C, and G. And now because you can do a D7 and a D suspended and a C7 and a C suspended and a G7 and a G suspended, you have all kinds of really cool options you can do to make up all kinds of stuff. And on top of that, not only that, but you can also make up your own songs. You can figure out songs. You can create melodies with these things. And when I say melodies, I talk about just playing the different notes inside of these chords. I love using that suspended chord right before I end it. That suspended chord to that G major. That's a great way to end a song. That way people will go, oh, whoa, this song is over now. So it's always a cool thing. If who's ever heard a song when instead of it ending, it just kind of fades out? You ever notice that some songs they just don't stop, they just kind of quieter and quieter, right? So it's a cool trick, but how could you do that live? How are you going to play a song like that live? You can't end a song like that at a concert, right? Like everyone in the band just gets quieter. Nah, they have to actually end it. So usually what a lot of guys like to do is use that suspended chord and then go to the regular major chord and it's over. And that's how a lot of guys will end songs like that live. They'll go, like, all right, we're done. All right. So does anybody have any questions about today?
No.
Okay. Well, I hope you guys had a lot of fun. All right, it was definitely fun for me. I love doing this. I love these all these variations of chords and how they're so useful.
It was great.
Awesome. Glad to hear that.
Bye.
All right. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Next time.
See you next time.